Present.
Good evening, and welcome to another one of our historical discussions. Today we'll be covering the Delafield Commission. It's an interesting place where the Civil War and the Crimean War, the Old World and the New World combine. And the Delafield Commission, as you know, the American observers in the Crimean War. So let's go over our principal characters here. First, Delafield.
Right, Major Delafield was an engineer officer, former superintendent at West Point, and before he was selected by the Secretary of War Jefferson Davis to go observe the Crimean War, he was chief of the fortifications defending New York Harbor, which was a pretty important position.
And Delafield is a brilliant person. He was first in his class at West Point. And as we discuss the Delafield Commission, the three principals each published their own report, their own book. Some of them are book length and some of them are a little shorter. But I've become familiar with all three, and I'm sure you have. And Delafield's is impeccable for what it is.
Yeah, he was, I would argue, one of the right men for the job, and there were other names that were
For the
around.
engineer.
Right.
And one of the things that I think I've discovered is with the Delafield Commission, everyone is hyper-focused on their area of expertise. And I think that's one of the great tragedies of the Delafield Commission, is that it's so short-sighted. And aside from the fact that it doesn't get published until right before the Civil War, that's one of the shortcomings of the commission. They observe a war with, as we've talked about, some of the great trials of the mid-19th century. Some of the problems they've had to overcome would have been a boon to someone in the know during the Civil War. So we have Delafield, and then we have Major Mordecai. Tell me about Major Mordecai, because that's your branch.
Yeah, he was an ordnance officer, expert on guns and artillery, particularly fortress guns. And Delafield himself being a fortification engineer, it fit right in with Jefferson Davis's intent, because he wanted to finish that program of sea forts along the coast that had been stagnant, and most of them remained semi-finished or
it kind
almost
of parallels
until
the
the
Palmerston
Civil War.
Fort. It parallels that Palmerston Fort in England, where the 40s and 50s, there's still that focus on masonry forts.
It was much worse, and some of these forts, like Fort Macon and others, that by the Civil War were supposed to have been complete and fully manned with guns, still had mostly empty casemates. But Mordecai was the man to send, because he had that institutional knowledge of guns and ordnance, and Delafield had the knowledge of the engineering side, fortifications. And they rounded it out with the third member of the commission, the most junior officer, Captain George Brenton McClellan.
Indeed.
Who was on Scott's staff in the Mexican-American War, where he distinguished himself. And he was in by 1855 in the 1st Cavalry. Very bright, astute 28-year-old, interest in railroads, already had foreign travel, and was seen as an expert in cavalry. And cavalry would dominate McClellan's report that he ultimately would submit. But these three men of different yet in some ways overlapping areas of expertise, selected by Jefferson Davis in April of 1855, as the Crimean War is wrapping up. Selected by Jefferson Davis to go observe the Crimean War. And you might have argued they should have sent someone a lot earlier, but
at the time, it doesn't look like the Crimea is all the way wrapped up. There's actually the entire second theater of the Crimean War in the Baltic. A lot of people are still thinking that that's going to be the big pièce de la résistance of the war. In fact, Kronstadt and the Baltic fortifications are mentioned in...
Right, it's one of the places Jefferson Davis wants them to
So
observe.
I'd like to read some of the points of why what they were to do when they were being sent over.
Camels.
Because Jeff Davis and his camels. But we know the why. They're going to be sent over to observe the Crimean War. They know that there's might be something to be learned.
Right, and this is a turning point in American military professionalism. It was the first government-financed commission of officers sent overseas to observe Europe. Previously, the officers had gone overseas, but they were on their own.
Yeah,
and they
like with the French invasion of Algeria.
Right, and then earlier after Waterloo, Sylvanus Thayer going over and observing, but that was all in a personal, endorsed by the government. The government said, yeah, they can represent us, but it was not official. This was the first time, so Jefferson Davis for the first time is saying, we as the United States Army, or in his case, the Department of War, need to catch up and learn what's going on in Europe with these new technologies that are coming out. Rifled small arms, rifled artillery, railroads, camels.
So I'd like to actually go through the verbiage of this because it's actually quite fascinating. It's, gentlemen, you have been selected to form a commission to visit Europe for the purpose of obtaining information with regard to the military service in general, especially the practical working of the changes which have been introduced of late years into the military systems of the principal nations of Europe. And then let's go down some of the more interesting points that he'd like them to research. The fitting up of vessels for transporting men and horses, and the arrangements for embarking and disembarking them, the medical and hospital arrangements, both permanent hospitals and in the field, the kind of clothing, camp equipage, and the kinds of small arms, ammunition, accoutrement, used in equipping troops for various branches of service, the practical advantages and disadvantages in the use of various kinds of rifle arms, which have been lately introduced extensively in European warfare, the nature and efficiency of ordnance and ammunition employed for field and siege operations, the construction of permanent fortifications, the Lancaster gun and other rifled cannon, the composition of trains for siege operations, the composition of bridge trains, kinds of boats, wagons, etc., the construction of casemated forts, and this one is the greatest. This one is the personal, please check this out for me, from Jeff Davis. The use of camels for transportation and their adaptation to cold and mountainous countries. It's great. Absolutely great.
It's such high hopes.
And this coincides with the US Army Camel Corps experiment, where the US Army is purchasing camels from North Africa and the Middle East, along with some of the camel drivers, and seeing whether it would work for a desert train, as it were, mostly for the transport of supplies rather than it being a combat service.
It was a good idea, ferry idea.
Yeah. And it says, it kind of micromanages, it says how they're supposed to go, and I think this ends up being one of the problems. He's suggesting that they go to the Allied camp and then through Sebastopol and to St. Petersburg, and visiting operations carried out in the Baltic. And then it kind of says, well, while you're there, why don't you observe the rest of the armies of Europe on your way back? It mentions Prussia and Austria and France in particular.
This was supposed to be a much shorter commission
Yeah,
than it actually was. What did he
they-
say,
this is
75
in-
days?
Well, this is in April, and it says they're to be back no later than the 1st of November.
So, 7 months-ish,
Yeah.
give or take.
Including travel.
And it turns out it was over a year.
Yeah.
Or over a year or nearly a year.
I think it's
383 days.
just over a year.
But that wasn't so much their fault. They tried
No.
to do it the way, because they left on, what did I say here? So they arrived in England on April 22nd. And they're trying to get, and this is my favorite part of this, they're trying to get to France and to go visit the French siege lines at Sevastopol in the Crimea. And they're, through this whole process, their chief focus is France and the French. They, all three of them had very little interest in seeing what the British were doing.
There's
the
a-
focus was
and
on
that's
the
the
French.
systemic problem until and after the Civil War. There is a U.S. military culture that is just obsessed with everything French.
And Delafield, I think he graduated from West Point, I want to say 1818 or 1819,
Yeah,
which was only 2 years after, Sylvanus Thayer comes, the father of West Point, and being
Yeah.
an OCS officer, I don't hold West Point up in glory. Sylvanus Thayer came back, and as the father of West Point, he brought 1,100 books back, all of them in French, or almost all of them in French, and instituted this instruction as the superintendent of West Point, instructing all the cadets in all the French drill, the French fencing, the French gymnastics, the French athletics, and it just elevates the cult of all things French.
well, it's the
In West Point.
post-Napoleonic.
And he brings French instructors, and the French instructors are teaching courses in West Point in French,
Yeah.
with the French library, and so everything French is military. It is enshrined, and what it's done, some historians have argued, and I agree with, is it created a precedent in American military professional culture to simply sit back on our heels and just go take whatever came out of France, adopt it, word for word, implement it in our army, or try to, with no further analysis and no attempt to figure things out for our own. It was simply, we will just go absorb whatever comes out of France.
And the caricature of that is the adoption of the Zouaves. That's the caricature. That's where you can look at it and say, wow, American volunteers really drink up the whole French mythos. And so they copy that, and they try to do that with the bayonet drill, with the style. But people don't also realize that the regular army, some of the very basic things they do in policy, in uniform, in armament, is all just a shameless copy of
French.
the French army.
The field manuals in use during the Civil War.
Just translate the French manuals.
Scott's manual for units larger than battalion was just a almost word for word copy of the translation of the French.
And of course,
And
McClellan.
Hardy's was almost a word for word translation of the French. And the ironic thing is that the tactics that they copied, the chasseur tactics, very early in the rifle musket era, where the French are determining how do we get around this new weapon? And their idea was, well, we'll just simply move a lot faster. By the time of the American Civil War, even the French themselves had given up on that and had gone back to the column attacks that we will see later at Solferino. But American soldiers, these brand new volunteers coming into the army, being taught 1840s, early 1850s French chasseur tactics as the cutting edge tactics of the day during the 1860s, training them for the last war.
Training them for the invasion of Algeria and the opening stages of the Crimean War.
But that's what these three officers wanted to see, were desperate to see, was the French.
Yeah.
So they arrive on April 22nd in England and immediately get permission from the British authorities to go visit the British siege lines in
they get
Crimea.
2 passes. They actually get a pass to go in a letter of introduction to Lord Raglan and a letter of introduction to the Admiral of the Baltic Fleet. So they have their option. They can go to either, but they're not too keen on it.
No, it's frustrating because, as we've discussed many times before, the British, by this point, even by 1855, were already starting to turn the corner away from the old Napoleonic bayonet tactics to what we would call fire tactics, whereas infantry engage and destroy other infantry on the battlefield with firepower, with small arms, instead of trying to close in and use the bayonet. So the rifle is now the principal weapon. The projectile it fires is the principal tool for destroying the enemy, instead of just using the projectile arms on the periphery for skirmishing to screen a column coming in to attack with the bayonet. It's more than just a stick to stick a bayonet.
But there's no dash and fire in that.
No, and the Delafield Commission had very little interest in seeing any of it. Now, by 1855, the School of Musketry at Hythe was up and running, and there were British officers, NCOs, and privates going through Hythe, being instructed on how to use their sights, how to aim at long distance, all the stuff we've discussed ad nauseum before, going on right there in the south of England. Not the slightest interest in seeing that. Where they wanted to go was France.
They wanted to go to France, where the parallel is the gymnasium. Every sergeant in every regiment, or one sergeant in every regiment, is supposed to go to this 6-month course where they do running and swimming and singing and
but these
all sorts of physical activities.
These academies in France at Vincennes and Metz, like Thayer had gone to the academy at Metz immediately after Waterloo, and then he comes back to West Point and is teaching this to Delafield. And so they wanted to go to the L'École Polytechnique. They didn't want to go to the School of Musketry at Hythe. It was not.
Well, as we talked about before, and as most people are experiencing in the middle of the 19th century, there is that Napoleonic mythos that you have to get over. And in the Crimean War, we see it with having to deal with Wellington still micromanaging some of the early production, as in the heavy caliber of the rifle.
Right, his legacy was still
and the Prussians still have that with von Wrangel, and the French, same thing. So it's hard to overcome that Napoleonic love of all things French, and it's dash and fire, and the School of Musketry is not as exciting as the French.
But the frustrating thing about the Delafield Commission is that you could read, it could be the Delafield Commission, or how we spent a year trying to see the French and never getting to until the very
because
end.
they love France, and yet when they get to France,
after 3 weeks of waiting in England for permission, they finally
they don't even have permission to enter France. Then they get permission to enter France, and they get told that it is French policy that you cannot go from a French camp into the camp of the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
No, it doesn't matter what sort of observer you are or who you are, but you will not enter the French army camp and then go see the Russians. You can go the other way,
Mm-hmm.
and they
They
say,
didn't want to go that way.
yeah, they say like the emperor realizes that there is a relationship between France and America, but
But they were on the rocks at the time
Yeah.
after the Ostend Declaration.
yes, the Austrian
So
Manifesto.
the French were annoyed with the United States at the time. It was bad timing. They arrived at a time when diplomacy.
And the French minister, the American minister to France was one of the authors
Right, he
of
was,
the
and
Austrian
yeah,
Manifesto.
and here he is saying, "Hey, I got these 3 observers coming over. Can you hook them up?" And the
And
French
no
are
one
like,
likes him.
"Oh!"
And
No.
they don't care for him, so he's not going to be able to pull any favors for them. So they decide that because the exchange back and forth happens. They go quite a few rounds of this. Could we do this? Could we do that? Because they
And
really
getting
want
absolutely
to,
nowhere.
and they're not getting anywhere. So they decide that they're going to have to start with the Russians, and then move down into
But
the
while
Allied
they're
camps.
in
But
France,
even with that plan, they say that there may not be permission to enter French camps, and they actually, that's the depressing thing about the here are these 3 officers that are in love with the French army, and they never officially get to enter French camps, even in the Crimea. I mean, there are a few occasions where they're received as guests, but they don't get to observe all of the things that they want to
well,
observe.
the entire time, the British are just, yeah, sure,
Yep.
come in. Yeah,
Come
you
in.
can come see our camp and walk over to the Russians. We
Yes.
don't care. Just don't tell them anything.
Yeah.
But the commission used their time in France to go to the opera many times, and they were quite a hit throughout their entire travels through Europe. They were a hit. It was
Yeah.
very rare to have an official American delegation of officers come visit, and so even though these are relatively low, majors and captains, which by European standards are a dime a dozen,
But they realize also it's they're majors and captains in a very small
in the
organization.
American army.
Yeah. But they're a hit at the opera in their next stop in Prussia. They're recognized.
Well,
as
they only go to Prussia because they wanted to go. Then the French say you can't come in, so they're like, well, shucks, nothing to see in the British siege line, so we might as well go to Russia. And France and Russia being at war had no diplomatic contact, so the nearest Russian authorities were in Berlin. So that's the only reason they went to Prussia next, was to talk to the Russian minister to the King of Prussia in Berlin. And once they get there, the Russian minister says the only people that can give you permission to go to our siege lines in the Crimea is the Tsar, the royal family themselves. That's the only people who can. But while they were in Prussia, they viewed some of the areas. They missed the Prussian general staff in their tour, I guess you could say. They took notes of everything else, like Jefferson Davis said. They scrupulously took notes about how far apart the hammocks were in Prussian troop ships. But the Prussian general staff only got a cursory mention, and the Delafield Commission has been criticized for missing, the one big innovation that came out of the mid-19th century, which is the general staff model. But you can't blame them too much for that, because the Prussian general staff in 1855 was not what it would be in 1866 and 1870 and 1914. it was itself in the process of recovering from the disaster of the Olmütz
Yes.
humiliation, where Prussia tried to mobilize against Austria, and they
failed.
couldn't even mobilize, and so that was 1852. This is 3 years later, so there would have been nothing really interesting or worthwhile to
Yeah,
note.
it's hard
at
to
that
blame
time.
those guys because we know that Britain and Prussia become incredible military powers, but they didn't at the time, and the dash and fire is all with the French. And with the Prussians, they have their string of defeats, and with the British, there's Gandamak, there's lots of blights on the military reputation of both of those armies. So it's they note all the things that they're supposed to, but there's not the fawning that the French get.
No, not yet at all.
No, but
So
so-
on to Russia.
on to Russia, and they have their minder when they're there. And when you see the daguerreotype of the commission, you see them taken. It's taken with their minder. But
But they were a big hit.
yeah, they were, and they get to meet the royal family.
Kronstadt.
Yep, they tour a lot of the Baltic defenses, and they see that's an entire theater of the war that is very little talked about, with the British and French fleets pinning down the Russians and completely blockading the Russians from their most important port.
But due to the fortifications at St. Petersburg, that was all the British could do.
Yeah.
You know, the British tried the bombardment and it didn't really go off.
And it's
So that
arguable
was,
that having to overcome those is one of the reasons why we start to see iron-cased ships, because we see those iron mortar batteries.
At Kinburn,
Yeah.
the French batteries, which resemble very much certain Confederate ironclads.
Well, that design is the design of a floating battery in the European system. I was looking at a book on, or I was reading the Great Siege of Gibraltar. It's I forget the author. I'll put the link in the description. But
Better.
I
Better not
will.
just say that.
I will. I always do. But in the 1780s, it looks like a sketch of CSS Virginia, but that is the design of floating batteries. But back to our topic. They get to Russia. They see the royal family.
And the Russians say, "Niet."
The Russians say,
They were
"Wait."
not going to our siege lines in Sebastopol, because by this point, I don't remember, did I write it down? June, yeah, they meet the Tsar, which is always fun,
Yes.
and he says, "Niet," because in July of 1855, it was not a good time to be in Sevastopol.
No.
The Russians knew, they weren't letting this out, of course,
Yeah.
but they knew it is not good. We don't want these Americans coming here and just in time to watch us lose.
They will have nothing to feed
Essentially.
them with. So they met the Tsar, get denied. Now where do they go?
Niet. Where did I say they go?
Did they go to my favorite place?
Yes, they go to your favorite
They
place.
go to
In September, they go to
Constantinople.
Constantinople, but the only
The
reason
Russians
they
shall
went,
not have it.
no, and the only reason they go there is the Ottoman Empire, supposedly being an equal partner among the Allies, and Britain and France going to war against Russia for poor little Turkey. They hope that maybe the Ottomans will give us permission to come into the siege lines and view
Yeah.
the French, but even that didn't.
Now there are
Didn't go
things
over.
for the commission to see on the Ottoman side of things. They actually observe the works at Varna, but that's a little later. But there's very little that the commission mentions about the Turks. McClellan actually has not a single reference in his report to the actual Ottoman army. He mentions that some people wear Turkish fezzes, but I think he's talking about the French at the time. But there's no mention of the Ottoman army. And they do mention our fourth ally, the Sardinians, quite a few times in all three of the reports. And again, I'll be putting in the links to all three of those reports. They are worth a read. I actually really enjoyed the Delafield report. And the Delafield report during the Civil War actually gets called secret information. It's a suppressed book because they fear the Confederates will...
Delafield does the most analysis of things. Whereas Mordecai, the ordnance and ammunition and artillery expert, he turns in a data dump, for lack of a better term. You know, the calibers of everything, the weight of all the bullets, the descriptions of all the artillery carriages, just raw data with very little analysis to go with it. Just, here's all the information you asked for, Jeff Davis.
So they get to Constantinople. There's not too much to see there from their perspective. They do not get permission to view the Turkish lines.
Or the French.
Or the French again.
So with
now,
nowhere else to
with
go. Oh
their
my gosh.
hats in their hands.
I guess if we have nothing else better to do,
fine,
we can go see the British lines.
Yes.
In the Crimea. And they get there, when did I see? October 8th. So they left in early April from the United States. And they don't arrive into the Crimea until October 8th, which is days.
So it's nearly a year after Balaclava and most of the early campaign.
And it's within days of the surrender of Sebastopol. So they arrive when everything is over and done, and the Russians capitulate. And so what they see and the first thing they do when they get there is they try to contact Marshal Plissier. So can we please come in? And he doesn't even give them the time of day.
Because Senator No is already dead at this point. So
Yeah.
it's the new commander that's the, I think they have a number of monikers for him, but he's like the hero of Sebastopol. They had a name for him in the book, but...
he didn't even acknowledge them. They're like, no. So this entire time, they're still trying to get to the French lines.
The British
and there's the British right
there
here.
You go.
But what they get to see is the siege at Sevastopol at the very end, when all of the British logistical problems had more or less been solved by this point.
It is a different world.
Because we discussed in our, when we talked about the logistics of the Crimean War, that first winter of 54-55 was appalling. And
men starving in the mud.
It was
and
terrible.
And when McClellan gets there, when the commissioners get there, it's the exact opposite.
Right.
We see railroads.
Mm-hmm.
We see telegraphs have been run between the coast and Varna on the continent, and it's a night and day situation.
Yep.
We have Mary Seacole running some of her catering out to the officers, and they're victorious.
The Board of Ordnance
So
is gone. You've got the more streamlined War Department. Supplies are going. The soldiers are well clothed. They're receiving the new pattern 1853 Enfield rifle. They've got all the food they can eat. And McClellan sees this, and he doesn't write about the logistics that he sees in the Crimea in his report. He's focused on all things cavalry. And on their way back, they stop in Austria, and he sees a peculiar looking saddle that had been used by Hungarian troops.
Ah, the McClellan saddle.
And it becomes, to this day, it's still used by the army. I found this out, that the army still uses the McClellan saddle for ceremonial things. So like official funerals, like the funeral of the president.
Yeah.
That is the regulation McClellan saddle on those
Shamelessly
horses.
taken.
But he doesn't write about what he saw among the British and to an extent French logistics in the Crimea, but it had to have impressed him because 7 years later he is in charge of a similar logistical operation in the American Civil War, where he takes the Army of the Potomac, and off the top of my head, I don't remember how large it is, but it's well over 100,000 men, and he moves it amphibiously and very successfully over a very short period of time from Washington to Fort Monroe at the end of the peninsula, and starts advancing up the peninsula in the
There are
Peninsula
so
campaign.
many parallels between the Crimean War and the Peninsula
He
campaign.
nails it
Yeah.
logistically and in terms of his organization. And he had to have taken a lot of mental notes from what he saw being done in the Crimea. Like, this worked. The
Yeah.
railroad worked. The way that the supplies came up worked. The way the British
The methodical
had
siege lines.
the ports and the wharves set up, how they
Yeah.
offloaded their equipment, their horses, their weapons. Because it's the end of the campaign, they were bringing in massive amounts of ordnance to fire into Sevastopol at the end of the campaign. So all of this stuff is moving, and McClellan, very young captain, is watching, and he would stash that away, and I believe it would serve him very well, especially with just his nature of who he was, this OCD
Meticulous.
organizer, very meticulous in that way, that this must have framed his future operation on the peninsula, and more importantly, it would have told him it can be done.
Absolutely.
And it, he brought his army to the peninsula, as we all know, in the campaign. They came this close to taking Richmond.
Yep.
And if it wasn't for bad intelligence that he was receiving on the one hand, which is generally is 200,000 troops, and then generally just ruthlessly attacking him again and again and again, that McClellan gets his cold feet and decides to back out. He was so close to winning with this flanking action that got around the Confederate defensive works at Fairfax that was blocking them from taking the overland route.
Yeah.
So he
And the
knew,
genius of it is logistics. It's the
and he knew it could be done because he saw it done in the Crimea.
So we move from the Crimea. We see a lot of he goes into Sebastopol, sees all the works from either side. McClellan does make a few observations on things that are sort of pertinent. The rifle pits.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about the rifle pits and how they were effective in countering some of the siege lines, keeping the men pinned down. The rifle pits, of course, being these small redoubts where Russian marksmen would be outside the siege lines of Sebastopol.
We see rifle pits used extensively in the Civil War. And that's one of the things that General Sheridan, when he goes to Europe during the Franco-Prussian War, criticized the Europeans for, is that they don't use the rifle pits that we use so well in our
Yes.
Civil War.
Yes.
They do
But,
war wrong.
Yes. And then he actually studies the ground quite meticulously at Balaclava, comments about the it being a good place for a cavalry charge.
He would know that.
He would know. And we see the actual Delafield report go into detail about how the actual siege lines are constructed on both sides. And those are a very interesting read. And Mordecai goes into detail about what ammunition both sides are using, correct?
Yes, in meticulous detail. It was great use to me when I was researching the infield cartridges and their development, because he took meticulous notes and helpful illustrations too, particularly with the French cartridges.
They all three books have great illustrations.
I wonder if that's part of the reason why they were delayed so long, because none of them came out in a timely manner, so to speak, after they got back.
It's an interesting situation. I mean, they really don't. The Delafield report comes out in 61 or 60.
One of them comes out in 61. I don't remember. I think it was Delafield.
The big one, the big book, the secret book.
But
the information
it was
in it,
years for all of them before they published them.
But the information in it, honestly, would have been a great boon to anyone commanding in the Civil War. But you can't blame them, because Delafield immediately gets placed in command of West Point. They all have jobs to do.
Right, and that's what I remember Mordecai begged an apology in the introduction to his work, saying that other duties have kept me from compiling all of the notes and the things that they brought back from Europe too. For instance, after they'd seen the Crimea and they're heading back towards the United States, they go to Vienna, and the Austrians give them examples of their brand new Lorenz rifles, the long rifle, the short rifle, the rifle with the precision sights for the specialized troops, and the rifle with the block sights for everyone else. Yeah. Here you go, and they gave them mountains of books and all this other information just freely given to them. So he said, it took me time to take all this stuff back and process it. In the meantime, I'm one officer in an army of 18,000 men charged with a massive area of responsibility. And so I was swamped, basically. And I could relate to being swamped and having to prioritize what's more important, this report on a war that's over, or what they're telling me I need to get done right now.
But so they leave the Crimea, they go to Varna. They move immediately to Varna, and that's another campaign of the Crimean War, where it's the Ottoman European holdings against the Russians, and there are lines at Varna that they study. But the movement into Austria is interesting for all three of the reports, and I like how McClellan goes into detail about the training of the Austrian cavalry. He asks the question, why is the Austrian cavalry good? Why does it have a reputation for being the finest cavalry in Europe? And he talks about how it's about the training of the individual. And I think that's one of the ironies of the report, is that he says the principal reason why the Austrian cavalry is great is because of the training of the individual. And yet, you have the disdain for the training of the individual soldier when you adopt the rifle musket.
There's still, McClellan especially, is all about individual training with the bayonet. And he wrote a handy little French-inspired booklet to that effect.
But with a lot of the French doctrine, you see only the officers or one of the sergeants being trained. For instance, the French musketry school just sends their officers.
Right, only officers, not even NCOs.
Yeah, but that's an interesting portion of the report is the cavalry in Austria, and they do spend quite a bit of time with the Austrians. They move from Varna up to Vienna. They spend some time in Venice, which is still Austrian, and then it's back to Vienna for a time. They spend quite a bit of time with the Austrians.
Lots of operas.
Lots of what?
Lots of operas.
Yes, lots of operas. Lots of being seen. And then they go back to France, and there's a lot of time spent in France. A lot of time spent in France. But even throughout their later stages, they're looking at all of the same things for their field. With Delafield there, he's looking at the masonry works. He's really looking at stone fortifications wherever they go. And of course Mordecai, they go up to Liège, where many of the muskets of European and American armies end up getting made.
Yeah, Liège was the arsenal of, it's like Birmingham for Britain. That was where, between there and Switzerland, all the arms for export were sold. As a takeaway, they came back with the report of all of this stuff, but the takeaway was that there's really nothing new that we need to change institutionally in the United States Army. They didn't come back with a groundbreaking revelation of, we're doing it wrong, we need to do this, we need to change that. It came back with a reinforcement of what we're already doing. We just keep doing.
There's a confirmation bias there. And in fact, a lot of the commentary has to do with, we've already adopted our new rifle musket, and that's all we need to do to have an effective infantry force.
We've spoken a lot about the rifle musket in the Crimean War at the early battles. Balaclava, Anchorman. By September of 1855, when they get there, most of those old veterans are gone. They've either rotated back or they've died of disease, and they've been replaced by new recruits from England, which were nowhere near as proficient with the rifle. So all of the remarkable things they might have seen the year before, the destroying angel cutting down Russian shock columns, attacking them with the bayonet at Anchorman, or British infantry silencing Russian artillery at 800 yards at Balaclava, they didn't see that, and they spent so little time there they might not have heard of that. So they come back with, nothing new under the sun to see here. Basically, we're doing the right thing. We've adopted the rifle musket. We're gonna double down on our bayonet training, and here's all the cool stuff we saw, and here's how far apart hammocks are in Prussian troop ships.
Yes.
Oh, and I found this really cool saddle. We should adopt it. And name it after myself.
So what is McClellan? McClellan being a huge influence on the American Civil War, how was he influenced by what he saw in the Crimean War?
He saw firsthand in the Crimea a successful force projection by the British and French over a long distance. So they took armies with all the supplies they needed and moved them by ship over a long distance in an attempt to turn the Russian flank, attack Russia in the south where they're more vulnerable. And you fast forward 7 years, spring of 1862, you've got Confederates dug in at Fairfax and Centerville, along the old Bull Run battlefield, dug in there well, and they've already tried to get through. McClellan knows that it is possible. He's seen it. A successful attempt to turn the enemy's flank, get around their strongest points and attack them where they are weaker amphibiously. He's seen it happen, so he moves the Army of the Potomac by sea in a brilliantly executed and almost flawless movement. And it was a remarkable coordination between the services.
And that really is what it is. It is a force projection. That's
it
what's
was a force
brilliant.
projection. It was brilliant, and it was a incredibly smart
And
strategy.
it's very similar to the
And
Crimean War.
Almost worked. It
Yeah.
failed
It
because
almost worked.
McClellan, you know, well, we know.
The execution is the shortcoming, but with the logistics, he learned from all of the
Right.
things that worked for both the British and the French. With
And
the
he-
British,
he knew it
the
would
War
work.
Department and the specifics of how everything was transported. With the French, the depot system,
Right.
and the way that even in some of his reports, he even goes into at the regimental level what they're doing, and he does note a lot of the how the different armies mess and how the different armies' equipment affects them, and all of that is put into all their reports. But again, there's the confirmation bias. This is what the Europeans are doing, and we're doing just
We're
fine.
doing the same thing. We'll just continue to copy.
We're doing very similar things. We have stone forts, we have nice saddles, we have rifles. Done.
But the commission was even though we went back and confirmed all the old stuff we've been doing, which is essentially, we will continue to borrow from the French. It was the start of a number of future commissions, because Jefferson Davis sent more observers than any other Secretary of War before him. It starts turning the corner of American military professionalism that we need to improve. At the end of the day, what comes back is we're just going to continue copying the French. And, I would argue the American Civil War, we copied the obsolete French
Yes.
tactics in our American Civil War. And I would argue, and leave your angry comments below, that the American Civil War was a very clumsily fought 1850 era French chasseur light infantry era of tactics, because that's what all the officers were being taught. Everyone was being taught Jomini at the tactical strategic level, and then on the field level, it's Scott and Hardy, which is warmed over French chasseur tactics. And that's what the Delafield Commission came back with, no real recommendation to change. That they didn't see anything, because they didn't really observe any battles. They observed a siege. And but it was an important stepping stone in the professional American military tradition. And McClellan took a lot from it. That had circumstances been ever so slightly different, he may well have taken Richmond in mid-1862 based on what he saw from the Crimea.
Now, one of the ultimate ironies that I think we need to mention before we wrap this up is the fact that Robert E. Lee was offered a spot on this commission. Jeff Davis did offer a spot to Robert E. Lee.
And he wrote that he was disappointed to have been unable to go.
Yeah. So perhaps
that might
perhaps
have been
things would have
very
gone
different.
differently if he was the engineer officer that got to observe.
Who knows?
Who knows? Who knows?
What might have been.
So any other takeaways from the Delafield Commission?
No, not particularly.
Nothing. Nothing at all.
Well, no, if we want to keep bagging on McClellan, I think he took away a lesson that you don't move until you're ready, for which he was stoutly criticized.
Quite.
But he would have heard when he was there in the Crimea, certainly, about the disaster of the winter before and the dangers of force projecting before you're ready to. So that's why he had such a, I would argue, this meticulous build all my logistical supplies up, have everything in place before I initiate movement. Because A, he had that luxury, and B, he saw it in the Crimea and what had happened. And
Yeah, and he saw them force projecting halfway across the earth. And he's thinking, we have internal lines,
for a couple hundred
we have the
miles.
Navy, there's no way that this isn't a simpler operation.
And he did that brilliantly. The peninsular movement was brilliantly and almost flawlessly executed.
So, all three books are out there. They are, I think, fascinating reads. My criticism, 150 years later, 160 years later, is that they do lack analysis that could have been given at the time, and that is the tragedy of the mid-19th century US military, where there's that inkling of professionalism there, but they are complacent with copying the French.
And they're also junior officers, majors and captains. You're not going to get
So it's a major that is very soon to be the superintendent of West Point. So I wouldn't call them juniors. They are all professionals in their field.
right, but at that, I would argue at that grade, you're not thinking strategically. You're not doing analytical Prussian general staff level thinking. It's more, here are the facts. It's kind of like in a middle school book report versus a doctoral thesis.
And then when you think about it like that, you can't blame McClellan for sending over if he's thinking at the company level, of course he's going to be sending back drawings of canteens and saddles.
Right, he's not thinking about the best, strategic use of cavalry. He's thinking the shape of the saber, how much curve on it, what kind of seat should the saddle be.
Yeah.
So.
But that's the Delafield Commission. I think it was there was a lot of potential there. Of course, we don't see it greatly affect the American Civil War from the actual reports, but it must have had an effect on Captain McClellan.
Mm-hmm. It gave him 7 years before he was leading the Army of the Potomac. He got a snapshot of the state of the art of war, and that served him well in the peninsula, and it might not have served him well with how much he wanted to hold back and delay, to the impatience of the president, who asked once to borrow his army if he wasn't going to use it.
But the rest is history.
It is.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching another one of our historical discussions. The links are in the description, and we shall see thee next time. Shall we away?